All right. Thanks for joining us in class today. This is class number 7, the class that was not supposed to be. So we're going to have one more after this. Today, what we're going to do is talk a little bit about, I'm going to answer some questions from last class, for one thing. And I created a handout for you for those things. And then we're going to talk about mutual funds. And then we're going to do the introduction to protecting your assets, which we'll do next week, protecting and controlling your assets. Because we've been talking about doing what you need to do to accumulate assets. And now we're going to talk next week. I'm going to introduce it today, but we'll talk about it more in detail next week on how to protect and control those assets. So let's pray, and we'll get into today's lesson. Father, we thank you today for your hands on our lives. We thank you for what you're doing in our lives. We thank you for each and every person who has an idea and just a desire to know more about how to get ahead in life, how to control their finances, how to get out of debt, how to allow you to actually be who you are in our lives, where we can really live a blessed life, knowing that we are free from the kinds of controls that debt has on us and the other things that just life in itself has on us when we do not allow you to be first in our lives. So we thank you for giving us the desire to be good stewards. And I thank you for today's class where we're going to talk about mutual funds and protecting your assets. And we give you honor and praise for it all. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. So today we're going to talk about your questions from last week. I'm going to have you pull out your sheet. So if you're watching this later, you should have a PDF with these questions from class number 6 on it. And we're going to talk about this. Someone asked me some questions because last week we talked about investing. We talked about some indices, which is the Dow Jones, the S&P 500, NASDAQ, and we talked about that. And I realized it is important for you to know the definitions of what these are. So I've come up with some quick definitions of what they are and where they came from so that you can get an understanding of what it is. These are all stock indexes. And the Dow Jones actually only have 30 companies in it, but they change. It's not always the same 30 companies. You have to qualify to be in there, and there's some qualifications. You can read them, some of them for yourself, and even do some investments. I mean, some investments, some investigating on for yourself. But you can see in your notes here, right in the middle, it says a stock is typically only added to the Dow Jones if the company has an excellent reputation, demonstrates sustained growth, and is of interest to a large number of investors. So if everybody's buying the stock, then that's one of the ways they qualify to be on the Dow Jones. But those are just basically the top 30. They're the 30 largest companies in the U.S. That's really who they are. And you can see it was started in 1896, but it's got to be a non-transportation or non-utility company and in the S&P 500. So you already qualify for the S&P 500, which means that you're in the top 500 of the United States. Then they grab 30 out of those to make the Dow Jones. And it's got to be headquartered in the United States. And I'm saying all that because there are some mutual funds that are not headquartered in the United States that do pretty good, but you have to decide and you have to look at them to make your own decisions as to whether that's someplace you want to put your money based on, their track record. And we're going to talk about that when we talk about mutual funds. Because all the mutual funds, all the stocks that are in mutual funds are also listed on these indexes. So that's why you need to understand a little bit about these indices to understand mutual funds. It's just a mutual fund is just a pool of investors who are putting their money together, and then a group of professional investors actually make the purchases instead of you figuring out, well, what company should I buy from? Instead of you figuring that out, they make this decision based on their goals for that particular mutual fund. Who decides how a company get in? You'd be amazed. I was surprised what I found out on this. Companies are literally at the mercy of a bunch of people who decide whether a company's inclusion makes sense. On the Dow's committee, 2 representatives from the Wall Street Journal and 3 from the S&P Global decide after evaluating the prices and all the other guidelines that we already just talked about. So after you meet those guidelines, then you just got a few people who make a few decisions, and you get in or you don't. What companies make up the S&P 500? S&P stands for Standard & Poor 500. That's a part of the Dow Jones Venture. They really are two in the same because the Dow is inside of the S&P. But it's a stock index comprising of the 500 largest companies, and usually is considered the best indicator of how we're doing in the United States, even than the Dow Jones, because you're looking at 500 of the largest companies instead of just 30 of the largest companies. So when you look at how they're doing and they value how the stock of all those companies are valued, that's what you're looking at the end of the day when they close the bell and they say, here's what the Dow Jones is today. That's the value, combined value of all those 30 companies in the Dow Jones. In the S&P, that's the value of all of those 500 companies in the Standard & Poor Index. And another good thing to understand is that because there's 500 companies, each one don't get equal amount of value in the actual index. For example, we give an example here. Companies like Apple, Amazon, which are huge companies, they have a more significant impact on the S&P index than smaller companies like Macy's or Harley-Davidson, that kind of stuff. Okay. Another good point is there's a wide range of valuations. Several of the largest companies in the X have over $1 trillion. Can you imagine a company over $1 trillion? It hasn't been too long since any company made that. Apple is one of those. That value is more than 200 times more than the smallest S&P companies, which those smallest ones are at least $6 and $7 billion. So those are some pretty big companies. Then we talked about the NASDAQ, and we said that the NASDAQ was typically a type of exchange. First of all, let's do the acronym because it means National Association of Security Dealers Automatic Quotation System. But it's the first electronic stock market. That's why you see movies and stuff from the old times when everybody used to be on the floor and making calls and yelling and all that. Well, NASDAQ was the first one that was electronic where you could sit on your computer and do that. And so they trade shares in several different types of companies, capital goods, consumer durables. So they're not just limited to like the energy or, transportation. It's all over the place. But what they're well known for is, and what we said last week, we said they're typically known for tech companies, but you don't have to be a tech company, but that's what they're most well known for. Okay. I'll explain the difference in common stock and preferred stock because for the NASDAQ, it must be common stock of a company. So preferred stocks only make up about 5%. So most of the stock in the NASDAQ is common stock. What a common stock is stock that basically everybody can buy common stock. Here's a good example of preferred. So, let me show you the qualifications first. Preferred stock, for example, if a company goes bankrupt, preferred stock owners get their stuff first. Okay. Well, I shouldn't say bankrupt, but if they're going out of business and there's a run on the money, people with preferred stock get their stock first. But one of the reasons is with preferred stock, you don't get the entire whatever the value is as the value goes up. It's limited. It's kind of like an index fund where since you're taking the value of some lows, you got some other benefits, you don't get all the value of the highs. Whereas a common stock, if the stock goes up to 96%, I had a mutual fund one year, did 96%. Okay, but that's the common stock. If you had preferred stock, you wouldn't have gotten that whole 96%, even though they got 96%. And so with preferred stock, your gains are more limited. That's because uh, they change slowly and they're tied to the interest rates instead of the value of the stock. Um, and the reason it's tied to the interest rate is an example of that is like when you have preferred stock pays dividends. Like I've had some stock before that pay dividends. When it paid dividends, you get dividends even if the company declares a dividend, even if the stock price doesn't rise, you get a dividend every year. Whether it's paid annually or quarterly, you're going to get your money for that preferred stock. And a lot of people use those kinds of investments when they are retiring because they put, let's say if they've accumulated a couple of $1 million over their lifetime, and then they put this in some kind of preferred stock where it pays dividends, then they just live off the dividends from that stock that they've actually created. So let's look at some of the performances of these different indices. The NASDAQ is usually compared with the S&P and the Dow Jones, but who knows what the dot-com bubble is? Who remembers what the dot-com bubble? You probably heard of it, right? The dot-com bubble happened in the year 2000 when companies that I was working for, a lot of them, they had us computer people going crazy because when they decided to create computers and do dates and stuff, they never thought about making a date past 2000. It was 1999 was the highest. So everybody had to scramble and update all these computers to make them so they could go beyond that. And a lot of companies went out of business. A lot of new companies got into business. And a lot of people played games and got fired or lost everything. But all kinds of stuff happened. But so from 2003 to 2020, NASDAQ outperformed the S&P. So you can see which ones outperformed which. NASDAQ outperformed S&P from 2003 to 2020 in 12 out of 18 of those years. So that's 2/3 of the time NASDAQ outperformed the S&P. And the Dow Jones more than 14 times. So in the wake of the Great Recession, which was basically 2008, you remember that one, right? That was when they had to bail out General Motors and Chrysler and all those. So in the wake of the Great Recession, NASDAQ outperformed the S&P 500 and Dow Jones 10 times. So the NASDAQ companies are basically, a lot of them are high-tech companies. They're the newer kind of companies that are doing stuff electronically. A lot of them are moving money that, people never used before. And so that's the NASDAQ. The S&P, which has been around one of the longest, has returned a historic annualized average return of around 11.88% since 1957 through the end of 2021. So you can see, if you look at the average rate of return for that index over the life that it's been here since 1957, it's 11.88%. So if you've got something that's at least performing as well as the S&P, then those, that's no guarantee, but that's the history. And that's really what they're saying. Okay, the NASDAQ index has made more than 14.74% in the last 36 years. That CAGR is just compound annual rate of return. So it's like compounding the interest. And so the NASDAQ, you can see it's done better in the last 36 years, but that's not as long as the S&P has been along. But you can see it's still outperformed, which means if you had invested $1,000 in 1986, you would have a portfolio of more than $14,132 as of last year. And then the Dow Jones, which is, average rate of return, I think that should be 1898 since since its inception, is 8.9%. 8.9%. The Dow Jones has been longer than 1998. I don't know where. Well, the beginning of the 1900s. I'll make sure I get that right, but 1998 doesn't sound right to me. All right. So, so mutual funds is a group of investors like yourselves and others who invest, and you pool that money together. Even if you personally don't pool it together, you putting it in a pool, and a group of professional investors take that money and then invest it in these kind of companies that we just talked about, the companies that are in these indices. And so let's take a look at mutual funds. I have some things on the screen to show you here. There are 4 basic types of mutual funds. They work by, as I said, pooling money together with many investors. Some things you should know though. You should only consider mutual funds if you've made it through steps, at least 1 and 2 of your baby steps. What's baby step number 1? At least $1,000 in your emergency fund. That's a real baby step. That's the first baby step. $1,000 in your mutual fund. If you don't have $1,000, don't even think about not in your mutual fund. If you don't have $1,000 set up in savings for emergencies, don't think about mutual funds. Don't even look at them. You know. But as I said, that's baby step number 1. But baby step number 2 is what? Who remembers what baby step number 2 is? Get out of debt. And so you need to have a plan to get out of debt, even if you're not completely out of debt, before you start looking at mutual funds. And with 3 to 6 months of expenses and savings. So you really need to be beyond that first baby step of just $1,000 in your emergency fund. You need to have at least 3 months of expenses in your emergency fund, because if you're starting to put money away in your mutual fund, it needs to be a place where you're not going to touch this money for a while. And if you got an emergency and you got to touch it, now you just blew your whole plan. Okay? So there are 4 basic types of mutual funds. There's growth fund, there's a growth and income fund, there are aggressive funds, and there are international mutual funds. And there's a lot of different names that you can mix these up and come up with different ones, but it's 4 basic types of mutual funds. And so let's take a look at the different ones. Growth funds are typically invested in what? Who knows? I think I missed something though. Let me back up. Didn't I miss something? What did I miss for you? Yeah, track record. That's what goes there. Track record. Yep. Okay. And did I miss something else? I'm good? Okay. So, um, oh, okay. Growth funds. Okay. Growth funds are typically invested in medium-sized companies. Medium-sized companies that are still in a growth stage. That's why they're medium-sized. If they're big, they've already grown. Like a growth fund, you wouldn't find people investing in Apple in a growth fund, because there's not a lot of growth to be had. They've if you look at real like billionaires, they look for smaller companies that they can grow. But so if you're looking at a growth fund, they're typically invested in medium-sized companies that's still in the growth stage. And then growth and income, that's the next one. Growth and income funds are the least aggressive. Growth and income funds are the least aggressive of the 4 types of fund. So it's pretty safe. They don't take as much risk as the other companies, as the other type of funds do. Yeah, they are the least aggressive. And they even invest in larger companies instead of medium size. They're investing in companies that are already big. They're not trying to get a whole bunch of growth. They're not taking a whole lot of risk. These companies have been around a long time. They've made money for people for over years. A lot of people have retired and made money off these companies and retired off these companies. And so growth and income, that's just what it means. I want to draw my income from this. Not I want some growth, but I want to be able to get an income from it. So that's a growth and income funds. Then the next one is, I just did that one right, lease type. Yeah, so that's aggressive growth. That's what goes there. Aggressive growth mutual funds. These are the most aggressive. So if you think about growth and income funds being the least aggressive, and they invest in large companies, and then you have growth funds that invest in medium-sized companies. What size companies you think? Well, it's on the board. Small. Small, active, and emerging. That's a word that you'll see. There are some funds that are called emerging funds, that where a lot of new companies, small companies, they even call them exciting companies, but that's aggressive growth. They are higher risk than the other ones. Yes. But sometimes if you have the time, when I say have the time, if you're in your 20s and 30s, you got time. Or if you've got other things in order and you're doing this you're basically working on your legacy for your next generation, you can put a portion of your money in these locations so that it can grow, even if you're not here later yourself. Go ahead. How much? I mean, what percentage? Oh, yeah. If you're 50, you don't. Okay. Yeah. So, are you getting any advice from anyone on that? Okay. Yeah. You want to get some advice from someone that's not directly tied to where the money's going, because it's hard for them to be objective. They make more money, but it might not be to your advantage. Um, but if you're 50 years old, it's time to start changing it around. Um, and and our office usually make recommendations based on your age, and I wouldn't want to just say just because you're 50, because there's other things besides just your age, like when do you want to retire? What are your expectations, and where are you now as far as debt and all that stuff. So you look at all of those kinds of things, um, and you see how it's performed in the past. If you've been doing this aggressive for 20 years, and it's because the last few years for aggressive funds have been doing really good. Yeah, 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 yeah. And but basically, when you start getting close to that age, you want to start moving at least some of your money into some index funds that where if you lose the principal, you still don't lose what you got. But in those aggressive funds, if they go bottom up, everything you gain is gone unless you can afford to leave it there until it goes up again. Okay. Then we have international funds, international mutual funds. International mutual funds, also referred to as overseas funds, represent companies outside the United States. And sometimes those are good companies to invest in. Some of them have good track records, so you want to make sure they got good track records. But if you want to invest in some things that, if things aren't going well for the United States and they're going well for Germany, then take a look. Depending on your stage of life, that's what goes there. Depending on your stage of life, you'll want to park different savings percentages in each of these 4 types of funds. Kind of what we were just talking about, depending on your stage of life. For example, if you're between 20 and 40, you should consider investing the largest percentage in growth funds, but not necessarily all of it. And you can even put some of it in aggressive, and then you can put small amounts. If you're this young, you can put small amounts in growth and income funds, just depending on your purpose. Then you spread the rest over the other 3 types based on your investment tolerance. Some people, they may be 21 years old, but they just can't take risk. It's like, no, I don't want to lose nothing ever. And some people, 65, they want to be aggressive. And it's like, let's put 75% in this one over here. And they're gamblers, That's basically what they're doing. But sometimes they win. But I always make sure I have enough so that if I lose, I don't lose. So if you are nearing your retirement age, you should place most of your savings in a what kind of fund? Kind of what we just talked about, huh? Low risk. So the low risk fund is growth income. Growth income fund with fewer risk, although there's not as much growth potential. Those are the medium-sized companies, which have been around a while, but there's some growth. They are not huge companies. They still have some growth. See, when you buy mutual funds, you want to grow the value of your shares. And so when you talk about a growth company, your price is basically going to increase as the company increase in value. And so it won't increase in value if it can't grow. So the best opportunity for growth is to actually get an aggressive fund that has smaller companies and they're doing stuff and they're growing, but there's risk in that. Sometimes a lot of those companies, even though they're great, they grow so fast that they can't manage themselves and then they peter out. And so you're investing in it because last year they did 90%. It's like, wow, but it's growing so fast they can't keep up with it from a leadership perspective. And then they end up, they either can't manufacture whatever they've designed, whatever it is. And then things like that get in the way. And then so the investors start backing off and then their value go down and then they peter out. But if a company has done it right for over a period of time, then that's a solid company. You're not going to get that 90%, but at least over a period of time you should be able to average 11, because that's what the NASDAQ has done for how many years since 1957? That's the average of what that's done since then. But that's the logic that you're using when you make those decisions. And that's what we want our clients to do. And I'm saying our clients. I don't have any clients anymore. But that's what we want our clients to know, is so they can make better decisions. Even when I would sit down with my clients, I want to educate them so they're not just taking what I'm saying. I want them to be educated so they can make that kind of decision for themselves. And so here's a last slide on this mutual funds. Some funds are blank versus blank. Now this is a word that you might see. There's some funds are load funds versus no load mutual funds. Load and no load. LOAD. Like they're loaded with fees. They're loaded with fees. So some funds are loaded versus no load mutual funds. Loaded mutual funds they charge commissions, and no load funds don't charge commissions. But all mutual funds charge different fees. There are all kinds of fees. Even the no load funds, there could be a fee for actually getting your money out. But when here's what you consider whether load or no load. This is something you should consider when you're thinking about load or no load. Because you would think, well, if I don't have to pay any fees, in other words, when we used to market, one of the biggest funds that I used to market back in the 80s and 90s, it was a front-end load, not just loaded. A load fund, basically, let's say 6% of what you put in is going to go for commissions and for other fees. So right away, all of your money is not working for you because some of it is going in commissions and going into fees, where that's a load. Well, a front-end load is where you're saying, I'm going to leave this money in here for at least 10 years, and I'm going to front-end load it. Instead of 6% for the whole 10 years, I want you to take out 20% for the first year. So all of my fees are taken care of in the first year. Then after that, because I'm still putting in the same amount, but after that, then most of my money is actually going to work for me instead of paying for the fees. And with that fund that I talked about that did 96%, that was one of those kinds of funds. But then you have other funds that are no load mutual funds, meaning that there's no commissions. But if there's no commissions, then I also question what kind of management am I getting if I'm not paying commissions. But so those are the trade-offs for what you're getting there. So those are mutual funds. So to wrap this class up today, I want to give an introduction to this last part here, protecting and controlling your assets. This is an introduction to what we're going to talk about next week, and I know we won't have time to do it all next week. Okay, so if you pull out your sheet that says protecting and controlling your assets, it is clearly God's plan. I'm going to put something else on the screen just so I don't confuse you. Boom. Protecting and controlling your assets. I believe it's clearly God's plan based on Scripture for us to invest and also pass on our assets to the next generation. Just because of Scripture that says a good man leaves an inheritance for his children's children. So that's part of who we are and part of what we should do is leave an inheritance for those that are coming along behind us. So what this session does is reveal some practical things that you should be doing as a part of your estate plan. I think you may have a blank there, right? As part of your estate plan. Your estate is basically what you've accumulated over your life, and when you pass away, then if you don't have certain things in order, the state actually has to decide what happens to your estate. So you should take care of these needs now instead of waiting till you're gone and then someone else has to take care of it. So what do these people have in common? Who do all they have on there? Michael Jackson, Prince, Jimi Hendrix, Sonny Bono, Aretha Franklin, dead rich people. Yep. So I researched it because one of the articles that I found actually said that they had no wills. At the time of death, they couldn't find the wills. So that's part of the problem. If you're going to have a will, have it so people know where it is that's still here. Okay? So at the time of their death, when Michael Jackson passed away, nobody thought he had a will. His mother immediately went and filed what's called there's a word for it when you don't have a will. I forgot what that's called. But she immediately filed court papers claiming it's called intestate. So she immediately filed papers saying that he didn't have a will. Although no matter what you file, it's going to take a long time for the courts to figure all this out. Okay? So although a will was later discovered, multiple wills were later discovered, immediately following his death, he died in 2009 when his mother filed that paper saying he doesn't have a will. Here's the reason. Michael Jackson's estate in the first 3 years after he died still generated over $500 million. So you can see why everybody would be saying, he said I was. His mom, well, but everybody, his daddy, everybody was claiming stuff. And but in the end, because his estate is settled now, they found one or two wills. And when you say one or two, once you get a will, you should have it updated if there are changes. So I think he had a will when he had his first kid, and then he updated it when he had more. And then I think there was an update so that no matter how many kids he had, that the kids, all of his children would have equal assets to the will. And I think it ended up where his mother ended up getting half, and then the rest of all his kids were split up with the rest. But when you don't have a will, it takes forever and ever for the courts to decide that. Okay? Prince did not have a will. He died in 2016. And his estate was worth $156 million, and he didn't have any kids, no wife. He only had siblings, and they were half sibs, and that's what the courts ended up finally settling in after 6 years. 6 years, and then, Yeah. Oh, you thought he were? Yeah, he must have blown a lot of money. Yeah. But anyway, who else? Sonny Bono. Who remembers who Sonny Bono was? Yeah, everybody remembers Cher. So Sonny Bono was married and had a child before Cher, and him had children before they were married. Cher was his second wife. By the time he died, it was his wife number 4. So Sonny died without a will, and immediately, because of they hadn't settled this before he died, Cher wanted her money. Because they had business together where they had songs written, and there was I can't think of the word, but anyway, she should have been getting monies, royalties, and all of that, and she hadn't been getting anything. So once he died, she went to court right away and said, this man owes me money. And his current wife, which is wife number 4, went, and then all of a sudden you got 2 people in court saying he owes me this, and she's saying, well, I deserve this, I'm his wife. And it took years and years and years and years for the courts to still figure that all out for them. But that's why you need a will. That's why if you're 18 years old, you need a will. If you're 18 years old, and especially if you got children, you need some kind of will. Now, the will is the basics. I'm going to suggest something else, but a will is basically the basics. Same thing happened with Jimi Hendrix. He died in 1970. His estate was worth $80 million, and there was battle over his estate. Guess how long there was fighting over his estate? 30 years. 30 years. And his estate still generates income. Aretha, one of the last people to die, they couldn't find her will, so they didn't think she had one either, but they actually found a written will in 2019, a year after she died. Eventually, 3 other wills were found. And Aretha died. She was worth $80 million at the time of her death, but at the same time, she owed a lot of money to the IRS just because it wasn't managed well. But once some lawyers got involved, they immediately took some of her assets, paid the IRS money off because that was growing. If you owe the IRS money, you got fees and taxes and interest on those that's increasing. It just keeps growing. And so they paid that off. And then her 3 sons, I believe, ended up splitting that money that was left. That still comes in. So, what is a will? Yes. Yes. Yeah, and it depends on what they say and why you did a different one. But for example, I forgot who found the first one, which probably was a will he talked to them about, and then later on after he had other kids and he talked to somebody else about it. But as he updates him, then the most recent one, if you have a will, you should update your will every couple of years. You should review it. Yeah, it has to be notarized. Yeah. So even if it's a handwritten will, it needs to be notarized. Okay. So a will is the basics of it. A will is basically a legal document, which means that it's something that's written down, and it's your last will and testament. That's what goes in that blank. It's your last will and testament. The purpose of a will is basically to help your family navigate all this stuff that's got to happen after you're dead without a lot of drama and anxiety. Because if you don't figure it out, there's a lot of drama and there's a lot of anxiety. People end up hating people. And some parents just don't know how to manage. They tell one person, when I die, I want this to happen. And nobody else knows anything. And then when that one person, when they die, then that one person starts telling them, they're like, well, who are you? And the parents didn't realize the damage they did. So a will does more than just say who gets what. If you have young children, if you don't have in your will what happens to you, if something happens to your children, the court decides. And it could end up because to the courts, it could look like the most closest relative is where they should go. And that might be the exact person you don't want to have. But that's where they're going if you don't have it in your will. So the court will decide who becomes their guardians. That's what goes in that blank. Not necessarily the person that you think should have them. A will outlines, that's what goes in that blank. A will outlines your plans for your children in detail. Another thing you should know is that estate planning laws are governed by the state, not federally. So if you move from one state, if you move here to Mississippi and you had a will when you were here and now you live in Mississippi, you need to update your will for the state that you're in because it's based on the state. Okay? Yes. Because when you go to if you die in Mississippi and that's where you live, those are the courts that's going to be making decisions if you don't have a will, and that's why you need to file it with that organization. Probate. No. When you get a will, an attorney has a copy because there's always an attorney involved. And you don't have to file it with anybody. You have your copy, but they take care of all of that. But when it's time, when you die, then they want a copy of that will. And then when the probate courts get a copy of that will, then if it's in Mississippi and they're saying you're in Michigan, this was from Michigan, then they can't enforce it. So you need to update it with an attorney there, yes. Yeah. Yeah. And you need to update it even if you don't move, just based on what's going on in your life, because things change. Okay. For example, here's a good example. We didn't think about it till about a year later. When we started GTM, about a year later, Thomasine and I remember, oh man, if something happens to us, there's a certain percentage goes to our favorite charity, which is the church that's named in there, which was our previous church. Now, if I hadn't changed that and something happened to us, and then GTM don't get nothing, so if something happens to me or Thomasine, there's a percentage of our estate that goes to GTM. So we had to update our will to do that. And another reason is because of our children. So now that Darren has passed away, we have to update our will based on all of that. So you have to update your will based on all that kind of stuff. Okay. Are there some more blanks I need to cover for you? The middle of the page, everyone. Oh, you on that page. Oh. What does it say? Okay. Okay. Everyone needs a will. Yeah. Everyone needs a will. Everyone needs a will. What page is that on? They die without drama and anxiety. And then, so in that second paragraph on that page, decides who becomes their guardians, talking about your children, and will outline your plans. Okay, then the last paragraph, going through the process of obtaining the will is not fun. It's not. Nobody likes to think about dying. It's always gruesome to go through, but death is inevitable. It's gonna happen, so you might as well prepare and plan for it. I suggest, so if you have a blended family, that's why I mentioned this. If you have a blended family, even if any of your kids are in a blended family, and you and your spouse are now in a blended family, but some of your kids married into a blended family, I suggest you look beyond a simple will and consider a living will and or living trust. And what we recommend is living trust, which has a will inside of it. So basically, all of our assets are not owned by us, it's owned by the trust, and we manage the trust as long as we live. And we have stated in the trust who manages it if something happens to me, who manages it if something happens to both of us. Yes. And again, you need to look at your assets and see what you have. If you have nothing to put in a trust, but those are all right. And then we'll pick this up, talking about protecting your assets next time as we close out the series. All right. All right. So God bless you. Thanks for joining us, giving us your time, and have a nice week.